Yo, what's up, Internet? My name is Anthony, and today the March Madness brackets got officially released for 2017. For those of you that don't know, March Madness is my favorite playoff format because of all the chaos. I don't really follow college basketball aside from this time of the year, and I'm going to fill out the brackets section by section, starting with the East, and I'm going to show it to you guys. So let's get started. Alrighty, so first up we have number 1 seed Villanova versus number 16 seed either Mount St. Mary's or New Orleans, and we all know that Villanova always is going to win because 1 always beats 16 every time. Next up we have a closer matchup, Wisconsin versus Virginia Tech. Now I know Wisconsin hasn't been in a very long time, maybe ever, and Virginia Tech was in pretty consistently, so I'm going to go with Virginia Tech. Next up we have Virginia versus UNC Wilmington. And this one is pretty clear to me. Virginia's always in there. I'm going to go with Virginia. And next up, we have Florida versus ETSU. I don't know what ETSU is, but I like Florida in this matchup. Next up, we have SMU versus Providence/USC. Personally, I think USC is going to beat Providence, but I don't see USC beating SMU. Next up, Baylor versus New Mexico State. Oh, come on. Baylor. Every time. Next up, South Carolina versus Marquette. Now, Marquette's always been in the March Madness bracket for a long time, and I don't remember South Carolina being in there, so I'm going to get a little upset here. I'm going to go with Marquette. And next up, Duke versus Troy. Duke is always a championship contender, so Duke. Now we're on to round 2 in the East bracket, and we have Villanova versus Virginia Tech. Villanova, the number 1 seed, defending champs. And then we have Virginia versus Florida. This is a 4 versus 5. I'm going to go with Virginia. Next up, SMU versus Baylor. SMU is the 6th seed, Baylor is number 3, but I like SMU in this case. And next up, Marquette versus Duke. Duke is a championship contender. I think they'll win pretty handily against Marquette. I'm going to roll with Duke. And finally, we have the number 1 seed Villanova versus the number 5 seed Virginia. I'm going to roll with Villanova. And next up, we have SMU versus Duke. As I've been saying, Duke is a championship contender. I'm going to roll with Duke. Now, here's where it gets interesting. We have number 1 seed defending champ Villanova versus Duke, who is peaking at the right time. It's a tough one. I'm going to roll with the team that's been there a lot versus the defending champs. I'm going to go with Duke. And with that being said, that makes Duke our winner in the East bracket. Next up, we have the West bracket with number 1 seed Gonzaga versus South Dakota State. I'm very proud of South Dakota State for getting in for the first time, but 1 always beats 16, Gonzaga. Next up, we have Northwestern versus Vanderbilt. Northwestern's a smart school. I have a friend who went to Northwestern, so I'm going to choose Northwestern. Notre Dame versus Princeton. Now, Princeton's a very smart school. They got in through the Ivy League, but let's be real, Notre Dame. West Virginia versus Bucknell. Now, this West Virginia, I have Virginia advancing a lot further than everyone. All right, next up we have Maryland versus Xavier. This is where I have a little upset going on. I like Xavier. They seem to always win. Let's go Xavier. Next up, Florida State versus Florida Gulf Coast. Now, I just remember Dunk City and that amazing, amazing upset into the Sweet 16. And I don't think of Florida State as a basketball school. I think of them as Florida State football Seminoles. Am I going to pick a crazy upset here? I can't do it. I got to go with Florida State. Next up, St. Mary's versus VCU. It seems like VCU always goes in as like a double-digit seed and advances further than people think. So I'm going to go with a little upset here as well with a VCU. And last up, we have Arizona versus North Dakota. Dakota, you did well this year, both North and South, but I think this is where your tournament ends for both of you guys. I'm going with Arizona. Now we're on to round 2 of the West bracket, and number 1 Gonzaga, number 8 Northwestern. Gonzaga. Now we have number 5 Notre Dame versus number 4 West Virginia. I'm feeling West Virginia in this one. And next up, Xavier versus Florida State. Florida State is number 3. Xavier is 11. Going with a little upset, Xavier. And now VCU versus Arizona. I gotta go with Arizona. And now we're on to Gonzaga versus West Virginia. West Virginia, you had a really good run, but Gonzaga is the number 1 seed for a reason. Next up, Xavier versus Arizona. For whatever reason, I don't like the 1 versus 2 in the finals. That just seems to never happen in March Madness. But in this case, I gotta go with it. Arizona. And lastly, we have Gonzaga versus Arizona. I don't know why, but Gonzaga seems to always disappoint towards this part. So I'm rolling with the number 2 seeded Arizona. Alrighty guys, we are now on to the Midwest region. And number 1 seed always beats number 16 seed, Kansas. I hope UC Davis does well. I kind of lived near there, but Kansas. Next up, Miami of Florida versus Michigan State. Michigan State really screwed me over last year. I had them going to the finals, and they lost in the first round, and probably one of the biggest upsets. But I'm going to roll with them again, Michigan State. Next up, Iowa State versus Nevada. Iowa State always does pretty well in these tournaments, and Nevada, I haven't really heard of them, so I'm going to roll with Iowa State. Next up, Purdue versus Vermont. Purdue always gets in these tournaments, and I can see them advancing past the first round, whereas I can't see that with Vermont. Next up, Carrington versus Rhode Island. I'm feeling Rhode Island in this one because I have a friend from Rhode Island, and I don't know anything about either of these teams. Oregon versus Iona. I know that the big man from Oregon tore his ACL, but they're still a pretty potent team. I'm going to go with Oregon. And Michigan versus Oklahoma State. Think of Michigan as a football. I think of both of these as football. You know what? Let's go with an upset. Oklahoma State. And lastly, we have Louisville versus Jacksonville State. I don't know anything about Jacksonville State. I don't even know if that's who's in the tournament. So I'm going to go with Louisville. Alrighty guys, we're on to round 2 of the Midwest region. Number 1 Kansas, number 9 Michigan State. I'm going to go with Kansas. I hope Michigan State doesn't. They always seem to do really well, except for when you expect them to, you know? And next up, 5 versus 4 again. I'm going to go with Purdue over Iowa State. And now we have Rhode Island versus Oregon. Oregon, they looked dynamic out there. Oklahoma State versus Louisville. I'm going to go with Louisville. And that's it for round 2. Here we go. Kansas versus Purdue. For some reason, I got to go with Kansas. And now we have Oregon versus Louisville. Oregon has just been playing so well, and they look so good. I'm going to go with Oregon. And lastly, we have Kansas versus Oregon. Kansas hasn't looked as dynamic this year, I thought. And Oregon wins by the 3, right? And 3 is better than 2. Go with a little twist here. Oregon into the Final 4. We're on to the south portion of the bracket. As you guys know, 1 always beats 16. Michael Jordan went to North Carolina. Arkansas versus Seton Hall. Arkansas looked pretty good against Kentucky, but yeah, Arkansas. Minnesota versus Middle Tennessee. I don't think of either of these teams as dynamic championship caliber teams. Let's go with their biggest upset of the season or tournament, Middle Tennessee. Butler versus Winthrop. I've never heard of Winthrop. Butler. Butler does well in these things. Cincinnati versus Kansas State or Wake Forest. I don't know why, but I think Kansas State is going to win, and I think they're going to beat Cincinnati. UCLA versus Kent State. I really like Lonzo Ball, and Kent State, I don't know, UCLA. Dayton versus Wichita State. I don't know why, but I always like these teams to advance a little past the first round, but since they're playing each other in the first round, let's go with Dayton. Next up, lastly, Kentucky versus North Kentucky. Come on, Kentucky. And now, round 2, North Carolina versus Arkansas, North Carolina. And then Middle Tennessee versus Butler. You got to go with Butler. Middle Tennessee, you had a good run. And lastly, Kansas State / Wake Forest versus UCLA. This is where the run ends, UCLA. Now Dayton versus Kentucky. I just don't see Kentucky seems to be peaking at the right time. Let's go with Kentucky. And now we're on to North Carolina versus Butler. I'm feeling an upset in here. I guess this is crazy for me to do. I'm just going to go with Butler anyway. UCLA versus Kentucky. Kentucky's a championship team, but this is the prettiest UCLA team I've seen in a long time. They did not win the tournament. You know what? Let's go Lonzo Ball, UCLA. You're better than Steph Curry, am I right? And now on to the final one. Butler versus UCLA. Go Lonzo Ball, UCLA. Alrighty guys, we are now on to the final 4. We have Duke coming in from the East, and from the West we have Arizona. From the Midwest we have Oregon, and from the South we have UCLA. This is a very Pac-12 thing, but I just randomly chose it. So, Duke versus Arizona, I'm going with Duke. Oregon versus UCLA, let's have our star, Lonzo Ball, UCLA. And lastly, Duke versus UCLA. Coach K, congrats, man. You're who I have being the national championship in the 2017 season. Thanks for watching, guys. Yeah.